Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is going to be a masterclass on JavaScript Object Methods. So I'm going to focus in a little bit on not objects and everything you can do with objects, not just classes, specifically on functions inside of objects and how they work. Okay, so let's just do a quick recap of what an object is. So in JavaScript, I can create an object. So let's say there's an object called me. So this is me creating a one-off object, aka like a singleton. Okay, and I can just sit there and I can add properties to this object. So maybe I have a property that's my name. So Alex Merced is my name, and then I can separate those properties with commas. And I can say my age, and currently I'm 36. So there is an object that represents me, and now that object exists. And I can access those properties. So I can be like console.log me.name, console.log me.age. And if I were to run this program, so let's see here, node scratch.js. See, I log the properties of the object, so I can access those properties, and I can also change those properties. So I could just be like, I can add properties, so I can be like, or I could change properties, so I could be like me.name, and we'll change it to Alex Merced. And then we'll add my first initial, H, Alex Merced. Okay, and then if I were to console log this again, the properties, it'll reflect the changes. Okay, so see now the name has changed. So it has properties. An object has properties, and it also has methods. Methods are functions that can be added to the object, which is just a property that has a function inside of it. So I could write a property like, I could write a function like this. This again, it's called a method because it's a function that's built into the object. So a normal function is just a freestanding function. A method is built into the object. So let's say I have a method called say hi. Okay, I could write it like this. I could be like, this is just a arrow function, and just say, hey, say hi equals this function, console.log hi. Okay. Hi. Okay. And now that I've defined this property again, I have to actually use the function. So if I want to use it, just like any function, I would be like me.sayHi, and then I can invoke it like any other function. So again, this is assuming that you do have some familiarity with objects and some familiarity with functions. If not, I recommend looking up my functions masterclass and my objects masterclass video. Watch those first, and you'll get a lot more out of this video. Okay. And see, I can say hi. Okay, now let's pretend I had a property called greeting. Okay, that shows you what I should say. So, hey. So instead of writing like console.log hi, I want to refer to that greeting property. Okay, now I could just do this, me.greeting, and that would technically work, but it's not programmatic in the sense that it, like, what if that function suddenly moves to like a different object? Then I'd be referring to it. It wouldn't be referring to. I'd be referring to the original object's greeting property, not the one that's running the function. So typically, what you do is you could use this keyword called this.greeting. This would represent the object that uses this function. So technically, that'd be me. Now, there's only one problem. So this method was defined using an arrow function. An arrow function is the only kind of function that cannot use the this keyword, okay? Because it doesn't have its own lexical scope. It borrows from the scope that it's in, which don't worry too much about what that means. It just means you can't use the word this, to keep it simple. So now if I run this, I'm gonna get like undefined because this doesn't exist in the scope of that function. Okay. So in that case, what I want to do, technically this would refer to the global object, in which doesn't have a property called greeting, to be technical about it. Okay, like if I do this, like I just say, hey, let's console log this, I get an empty object because this is referring to not me. So what if I did want to use this the way it was intended? Well, then I have to use the function keyword. So I would define the function like this, use the word function. And then in curly brackets, I can then define what the function does. And then in this syntax, I can type in like this dot greeting. And now I have this would be the same thing as writing me. Okay, because that's the object that's using it. And see, hey, it works. I could also write methods like this. There's a third way of writing methods in JavaScript objects. I could just do a traditional property with like the name of the property and a colon, and then afterwards put like an arrow function or a function using the function keyword like this. But I could also just do this. I could do like say hi to, and just write it like a function without the function keyword, just like this. This syntax I'm not a big fan of. I just find it like it's not obvious that you should be able to do that. So I find it sometimes not as illustrative. But essentially, I could write a method like that, and it just knows that it's supposed to be a property of the object. So I can just be like console.log this, and this should be called like say hi to. Or just say like the same stats. Okay, or actually we'll call it print me. Okay, and we'll just say console log this, which should be me. Okay, right? Because this refers to the object. This is the object, and since this is inside in a function that's inside that object, it's referring to that object. So when I do like me dot print me, and you can see when I hit dot, Visual Studio Code will show me all the properties of the object as I've defined them so far. So it recognizes that print me property. I can invoke that function, that method, and see there, I can see what's inside of me. Okay, so that's one way to define an object, okay? But sometimes you need like a lot of objects. So imagine like a video game where you need lots of villains. So instead of like creating each villain one by one by using like this syntax, you can use what's called object-oriented programming. There's two ways of doing this. The old way of doing it in JavaScript, which I don't recommend because it's not the easiest thing to understand, is you would do this. You would write a function and would say like function villain, okay? And then we could say something like, you know, this.name. I can use this inside the function because the way functions were made in JavaScript, it just naturally, it could be used as a constructor, has like this secondary job. They eventually separate this into classes, and classes are a better way of doing it. So that way when you write classes, you're just thinking objects, and when you're writing functions, you can think like things that it's doing. Okay. Okay, so basically I can create this function, and this seems weird, like the function doesn't return anything, it doesn't really do anything other than say like this.name is villain. Okay, like that's a weird way of using a function. But technically what you can do in JavaScript is I can now use this to create objects. So I can say like const evil villain, that's going to be the variable, equals, and then I use the new keyword, a new villain. And see, when you use this new keyword, it creates an object that inside the function you can use this keyword to like build it up. So you can say like this.this equals that, this.this equals this, and you end up with an object. Okay, again, this is not typically how it's done in most languages, and it's just a really weird way of doing things. So if I console log this and say, hey, let's console log evil villain. Okay, so you see I get that object. Okay, and I can create as many objects as I want like this. So you'll sometimes see this when you see like older JavaScript code, or people who've been writing JavaScript code for like over a decade before they made this simpler. The way you should do this now, okay, if you're writing modern JavaScript, is you shouldn't write a function, because it gets confusing to see functions being used in this way, because I use functions to write traditional functions, which are just like, you know, like a speed dial for a batch of code. What I really want to do is create something that's going to, like a blueprint for an object. So what they did is they took the same feature, but they gave it a new wrapper. So that way it looks like other languages, which use something called classes. So I can say class villain and put two curly brackets around it. And this gives you the same thing that that function gave you a second ago, but now it's, and in here I can define any functions villains will have. So I could also define what's called a constructor function. So that function really is a constructor, the one you saw before. Now, so basically now the job of that villain function you saw earlier is now moved to this constructor function. Okay, and this would be where I put like this.name equals villain. Okay, but you see like this is like a different thing than a function. So now it's like what I'm trying to do, create a blueprint for me to create villain objects, makes this much more obvious. Okay. So now if I run this code, see, it does the same thing, but this is more typical to what you'll see in most languages, using classes to create that blueprint for creating objects. And then I can define functions in here. So I can define methods, and so I can be like, say my name. And then here I can use this all I want. So I can just be like console.log this.name. Okay, because this class has a context of the constructed object. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this constructor function where it takes one argument, name, and then instead of saying like the name is arbitrary villain, we'll say the name equals the name. So we're going to create a new villain, and the name of the villain is going to be like Skeletor. And let's console log. We'll change this to Skeletor. And we'll say Skeletor dot say my name. And we'll create another villain. So we'll say const what's a good name? We'll just say classic villains. You think I'd be able to think of more? Let's see here. Rita Repulsa. Okay, so Rita Repulsa from Power Rangers equals new villain Rita Repulsa. And then I can be like Rita Repulsa dot say my name. Okay. And you see the proper name comes out, because even though in the function I just say this dot name, it refers to the function that's making the call. So in this situation, it's Skeletor who's calling the say my name function. So this becomes a reference to the Skeletor object. And then in this case, say my name is being called by the Rita Repulsa object. So it refers to that. So it's going to look for a property called name on that object. So that's why this is much better than why this is useful. Because especially when I'm building a class and my intention is to create many instances of that class, that's pretty useful. Okay. Now, other things you can do as far as creating functions inside of a class. Okay. What we can do is you can actually define, if you wanted to use like arrow functions, you could do something like this dot, my say hi equals, and then I could assign an arrow function this way. There is a console.log say hi, and I'll show you a downside of this. Depends what you're trying to do. Okay, now actually let me use this function. So let's say Rita Repulsa dot say hi, and it works. See, so she says hi right there. You can see that it says hi, but now watch what happens when I console log the object. So I'm going to get rid of all these properties here. I'm just going to console log these objects. Console.log Skeletor and Rita Repulsa. Okay. So now what happens? If I take a look at the Skeletor object, notice we see the say hi function, but we don't see the say my name function. You don't see that listed there. Same thing with Rita Repulsa. The reason being is that technically there is no property built into that object. What happens is that really the way classes work in JavaScript, and this is different than other languages. In other languages, it would just have everything. What happens in JavaScript, you use a pattern called a prototype. So really what's happening is that there's this prototype object that exists, that's the class. And the class has the say my name method. Okay? So when I call say my name on the Skeletor or Rita object, it's going to ask JavaScript, does this object have a prototype? Like, does it have like this other object that's linked to it? And it's going to be like, yes, it has this villain class as the prototype. Okay, and that prototype, the villain, it'll see that it'll look at that one and say, hey, look, this thing does have a say my name function, so I'm going to use that. Okay, while when I add properties directly in the constructor, I'm adding properties directly to the instance. Okay, so really when you console log an object, you're only seeing the properties on the instance, not on like the class. And there's trade-offs. Okay, so if I define something as the benefit of having things on the class, like be a part of the prototype, is that it only gets defined once. So the say my name function only exists one time. I can create 1,000 villains, and there's only one say my name function that they all use. Okay, but if I create 1,000 villains, each one gets a copy of the say hi function, and there are now 1,000 copies of the say hi function in my computer's memory. Now this function will run, the say hi function is going to run a little bit faster because it's bundled with the instance of the object. Okay, so if you imagine like the computer's like there's a physical memory where your computer is doing all these operations, there's like the clump of properties that this instance has, and there's the say hi function. So it's going to be able to get to it really fast. While say my name is going to be wherever like that villain prototype is stored, which might not be close, it might be far, but it might be slower to access that property because it has to go somewhere physically further in the memory. It's still probably better to do it that way because memory sometimes is more of an issue. Processors are faster, but there's a lot of things that take up a lot of memory. But there is like a trade-off. Okay, so this will run faster. This will eat up less memory. Okay, but you can tell where the property exists because if I console log the object, if I see the property, it exists on the instance. If I don't see it, it exists on the prototype. This is why if you console log an array, you don't see all the different array methods there, because all those functions that are built into arrays aren't built into the array you created. They're built into the prototype of arrays. And this is sort of, again, a unique JavaScript thing. It was just the way sort of Brendan Eich decided to create the language when he created the language in 10 days back in like 1996. But it has its benefits, and it has this kind of cool patterns and things you can take advantage of. But this class syntax allows that prototype architecture in JavaScript to feel like just like any other language that uses classes, which is nice. So you don't have to think about it. Like, as long as you understand classes in general and how they work across multiple programming languages, you could just use the class syntax in JavaScript without having to really like fundamentally truly appreciate prototypes. Although I do have a prototype masterclass video if you want to see like a much deeper dive into how prototypes work. But yeah, so that's all the different ways you can like add functions to an object, whether you're creating an individual object using like an object literal syntax with the curly brackets, or if you're creating the blueprint for an object using a class and then instantiating it using the new keyword. Either way, there are ways for you to add functions to that object. And then you just call the functions like you would call any other function. So hopefully you found this useful. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Do subscribe to my podcast, Web Dev 101 and Data Nation on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and have a great day.